for our 69th annual conference of the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Florida, focusing on indigenous rights, environmental change, and development in South America's Gran Chaco. We have, again, for those who are just joining us today, a special set of sessions that focus on the edited volume that is forthcoming from the University Press of Florida, edited by Hirsch, Biocca, and Canova, which is Reimagining the Gran Chaco. So today's second session features Nancy Postero, Mercedes Biocca, Denise Humphreys Bebbington, Guido Cortez, and myself. And so without further ado, just to remind everyone as well, speakers will have about 15 minutes of time to give their presentations. We'll hold the questions till the end, but there will be an open period for questions and conversation at the end. Por favor, ponen sus preguntas en el chat, o al final también se pueden sumar la conversación, abrir las cámaras y preguntar directamente. Por favor, está totalmente abierto para una conversación. Entonces, ya, con mucho gusto, invito a Nancy Postero para la primera paper, por favor. Estás sin audio, or are you without audio?
Thank you. The most popular word since the pandemic hit is "you're muted." So very, very happy to be here with all of you. Thanks again to the editors for all their hard work in getting this volume going. So I'm going to share my screen. Hold on. Can you see my screen?
Looks good.
Okay, great. Great. Super. Well, so I'm going to be talking today about Guarani diplomacy in Charagua. In 2005, as many of you know, Bolivia elected its first indigenous president, Evo Morales. Morales, who came to power vowing to enact indigenous rights, presided over a 2006 Constituent Assembly that rewrote the Constitution to refound Bolivia as a new plurinational state. The resulting 2009 Constitution declares the fundamental goal of the state to be decolonization. It also recognizes indigenous peoples and their cultures and values as central to the new state, and it grants them important new rights, echoing the language of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. The intervening years, however, have brought enormous debates about the meaning of these constitutional rights, especially as Bolivia has continued its full-on dedication to a development model based on natural resource extraction. In my 2017 book, The Indigenous State, I traced the arc of the first 10 years of the Morales regime. And I argue that at the beginning of the regime, indigeneity and decolonization formed the basis of an emancipatory politics aimed at overturning colonial and neoliberal legacies. However, over the following decade, Morales and his MAS, Movimiento al Socialismo party, moved away from that early commitment to indigenous rights towards a policy of economic liberation based on resource extraction and limited redistribution of its profits. In the process, for many urban indigenous people linked to the global market through commerce, or for those hoping to improve their living standards, indigeneity began to take a backseat to class as they worked to climb the ladder to the middle class. For them, decolonization has more to do with national sovereignty than local autonomy. Here in this chapter and today, I take up a very different situation, the case of Charagua, where the indigenous Guarani activists in the municipality in the Bolivian Chaco won an important victory, establishing their municipality as the country's first IOC, or Indigenous Autonomous Municipality, in 2015. The Guaranis of Charagua strategically used the rights established in the new constitution to move towards their long-term goal of reconstituting a Guarani nation. So for the Guaranis, decolonization is an important goal and a discourse and a set of juridical tools that they utilize in their own struggle for local autonomy. The victory in Charagua was a first step in what is likely to be a long process of seeking autonomous status for indigenous lands. Several more communities have achieved this status since Charagua won their victory, and many more communities are in the pipeline. So in this chapter, I focused on how Guarani leaders managed to overcome local tensions in Charagua and in the region, in the department, to win the election through their, what I'm calling pragmatic politics, as they negotiated the spaces between national, departmental, and local sovereignties. While still subsumed within the liberal nation state, that is, this is not a matter or a model of complete self-determination. This new form of local government offers the first vision of indigenous alternatives to liberalism, a first glimpse of what an indigenous state really could mean at the local level. So let me tell you about Charagua's long path to autonomy. It was a grueling 5-year-long process. It started with an initial public referendum, followed by a 2-year-long assembly to draft an autonomy statute. Then that statute went to the National Constitutional Tribunal, and after several rounds of revisions, it was finally approved. And here's a picture of the Guarani leaders once they found out that their constitution had been approved. In 2015, there was a hotly contested final public referendum in which autonomy won by a very small margin, but it made Charagua Bolivia's first IOC, or indigenous autonomy. So Charagua is a large municipality in Chaco's high desert. It's actually very large geographically. It has about 35,000 inhabitants, 80% of whom are indigenous Guarani. The white mestizo cattle ranching families have for many generations been the city's dominant political and economic bloc. In 2010, when the Guaranis began their autonomy bid, they relied on the MAS government's language of plurinationalism and indigenous reivindicación. As a result, their initiative was deeply threatening to these local elites who held power in the town. And the elites felt that the indigenous process was imposed by the enemy MAS state, and mostly they feared it would end their control over the department's resources. They also expressed really openly, particularly to me, a deep racism when they spoke of the possible future under indigenous autonomy, relying on these classic tropes of the corrupt, lazy, or backward Indian. These white mestizo leaders really couldn't imagine ceding or even sharing power with their indigenous neighbors. As the MAS project moved from, as I've said in my book, from politics to policing, especially after the Tipnis controversy, where the MAS government repressed indigenous people protesting a highway project in another part of Bolivia, the Guaranis were really leery about linking themselves to the MAS. But with the autonomy process mired in bureaucratic procedures and really not certain to win, the Guaranis decided to work with both the Verdes, that is the lowland conservative elite of Santa Cruz, and with the MAS, a very tricky strategic move. So I want to tell you a little bit about what they did in both at the department level and at the local level. So Charagua is in the department of Santa Cruz, which is controlled by the Verdes, the Demócratas, the party of the traditional Cruceño elites. There, the Guaranis decided to work with the Verdes, taking advantage of the new electoral scheme that guaranteed each of the 5 indigenous groups in the department one representative to the Santa Cruz legislature. So in order for the department money to flow to their municipality and to get the governor and the legislature to approve development projects in the Chaco area, the indigenous asambleístas work closely with the departmental ministries to get things like electric power and housing developments out to the region. But more importantly, the indigenous asambleístas collaborated with the Verde legislators to pass the departmental autonomy statute. This was part of the right-wing opposition's long-held dream of regional autonomy and a key site of challenge to the MAS. The asambleístas worked to make sure that indigenous rights, especially autonomy, were inserted into this departmental autonomy statute. And so this was really a critical step towards autonomy in the long term, but it also positioned the indigenous communities right in between the MAS and the Verdes, who were fighting over power at the departmental level. The resulting legislative session to approve and amend the statute was a spectacular event. When the votes were called, all 17 representatives of the Verde side of the hall raised their hands in assent, along with the 5 Indigenous representatives at their side. And you can see the first person on the top picture is one of the Indigenous asambleístas. So the departmental statute was approved, and it supported not only regional autonomy, but also Indigenous communities' autonomy. The next day, the legislators presented the approved statute to Governor Costas, who you see in the bottom picture, in an even more spectacular event. In front of the region's gathered elite, all white mestizos, Governor Costas embraced the leaders of the 5 Indigenous groups, saying that they were Iyambaye, using the Guarani word for freedom that this departmental autonomy movement has claimed. And then he acknowledged that without those 5 votes, the Indigenous votes, the Verdes couldn't have passed a new statute. He turned to the crowd and said, "I told our Indigenous brothers, don't worry, now there will be development for all. Let us prepare to move forward." And here we see a tenuous balance as groups with very different notions of autonomy use the same word, autonomy, to coalesce around an apparent alliance. This equivocation was managed, and here I'm using Viveros de Castro's term, in part by falling back to the aspect of sovereignty that everyone seemed to support, economic development. The Guarani were pushing for a municipal Indigenous autonomy that would be wholly separate from departmental autonomy. Yet they are also residents of the department, and they benefit in both material and political ways from their patron-client relationship with the governor. So thus, by seeming like they were all pushing for the same thing, both parties gained a political ally in uncertain times. At home in Charagua, on the other hand, the Guaranis chose another path, an alliance with the MAS. They began in 2014 national elections, putting forth a Guarani candidate as a MAS congressman to the national legislature, and that campaign was very successful. Then in the March 2015 municipal elections, they campaigned with the blue banner of the MAS, and they handily won the mayor's position and 4 city councilors, giving them the majority. That means they got control of the mayor's office and the city council in Charagua. And once in control, they used their official position to push their most pressing goal, the approval of their own local Indigenous autonomy statute in the 2015 referendum. And this was evident at a summit meeting in August 2015 that brought together protagonists for Indigenous autonomy from municipalities all over the Chaco region, with officials from various government ministries, from the central state, from other cities, and from funding institutions. During the final afternoon of the summit, of the cumbre, participants delivered the results of their deliberations to the ministers in a public display in the town's open-air coliseum. The Guarani mayor made a brilliant tactical move, linking Charagua's Indigenous autonomy to new development projects. And he used the language of the MAS, declaring, "We are going to continue the process of change, the proceso de cambio, right here. You can't be plurinational without Indigenous autonomy. Here we will practice interculturality every day, defending democracy and promoting development for all. This is autonomy." And then he began bringing out bulging notebooks or folders with all the projects that they planned: the completion of a new paved highway to the town, a new coliseum, a new school building, a bus terminal, and a municipal market. Entrusted to take these enormous projects and stacks and notebooks back to La Paz, the ministers were covered with Guarani textiles and sent on their way. Once again, we see how the Guaranis skillfully negotiated between the central state, intent on consolidating power to itself, and their own vision of local autonomy by using the ambiguous term development as if everyone agreed what that means. So how do we understand these enactments of local politics? Certainly, this is an example of pragmatic negotiations that local politicians all over the world carry out. But I think this case also reveals how productive ambiguity can be in political struggles. When Governor Costas used the word Guarani for freedom, Iyambay, and insisted that his Indigenous brothers were part of departmental autonomy. The Guarani leaders did not contest his use of this word to draw attention to their more radical notion of autonomy. Playing between these two larger entities and political parties, the Guaranis were able to ensure that indigenous autonomy has a legal precedence in the department statute, and that they won their referendum, and that funds flow from the department to the new autonomous Charagua. And certainly that's what's happening. Here's the new highway from El Espino to out to Charagua, right in the middle of construction. You can see that their bet paid off. When I asked my indigenous collaborators in Charagua how they managed this dizzying dance between political parties and ambiguous meanings, they just shook their heads, trying to make me understand. One said, "We have always lived this way in this space, in this ambiguous space. This is how we work." And certainly historians have shown that since colonial times, indigenous groups have managed this multiplicity, living and working between partially connected worlds of rural collective communities on the one hand, in mines, markets, and elite-controlled states on the other. The Guaranis especially have always been good at this, forging temporary alliances with different groups to ensure their survival, but not disappearing in the process, as we've heard from the papers in the first panel. Pifare has argued that the central strategy over time of the Guaranis was to make pacts without selling themselves to the Carais, or the whites. This, which he calls Guarani Diplomacy, has given them a practical understanding of how to negotiate with ambiguity. So since starting in 2018, the Charaguans elected their new representatives to their new autonomous assemblies, and they've begun the complex job of governing in the first IOC in Bolivia. In a Latin American Research Review paper published last year, Jason Tachman and I have examined the workings of the new government over the first 5 years, and we argue that it appears to be a very functional form of indigenous self-government. Most interesting is the structure of their new government that you can see here in this diagram. Instead of having the executive leading the government and being on the top of the diagram, like most organigramas would show, here you can see that the executive is on the bottom of the list. And instead of having them make all the decisions, in this model, the organs of collective decision-making, the Nyambuatireta, make the legislative decisions, and then the executive implements it. Of course, there have been conflicts in making all this works, and there are now really, debates about, who actually has more power, but they're working it out. There's also new debates about whether these new elected officials have as much authority as the traditional leaders, the Muruvichireta. But overall, the process seems to be working on Guarani notions of collective governance. I love this picture of Guaranis voting and deciding in their assembleas. There are substantial challenges ahead, however. They're still struggling I'm almost done. Thank you, Joel. They are still struggling to determine what their relation to the central government will be, and they've drafted a controversial statute requiring local consent for any development on their lands. And this, of course, is critical since their lands are the sites of ongoing gas production. Since this goes beyond the constitutional requirements of consultation, this may be setting up a significant challenge to the central state. So it's going to be very interesting to see how Guarani diplomacy works in such a situation. I'll leave it there. Just to say also thanks to everyone. And if you want to read more about this, you can read it in an open access version of my book. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Nancy. Really appreciate that. And it also articulates very well with some conversations from yesterday where some folks from Charagua y Yambay were in the conversation. So looking forward to discussing more soon. Next up is Mercedes Biocca. Por favor.
Voy a ver si el truco de Nancy funciona ahora. Vamos a ver.
Va a funcionar.
¿Estamos más o menos? ¿Se ve bien?
Perfecto, perfecto.
Bueno. Voy a empezar compartiendo con ustedes unas fotos de mi trabajo de campo que realicé en la provincia de Chaco, más precisamente en la localidad de Pampa del Indio, en el noreste provincial, que está habitado por población com, y en el paraje Las Tolderías, que se encuentra ubicado en el sudoeste de la provincia y habitado allí por población mocoit o mocoví. Estas fotos muestran las transformaciones que se produjeron en esa provincia en las últimas décadas. Como pueden observar, los montes fueron transformados en pampas, el algodón fue reemplazado por soja, y los carpidores y recolectores, que en muchos casos eran indígenas, fueron reemplazados por grandes maquinarias. Todos estos cambios generaron verdaderas geografías de desposesión. Sin embargo, hay algo que en estas fotos no se observa, y lo que no está aquí reflejado es el proceso de esa destrucción. No podemos ver cómo se produjeron estas transformaciones, si hubo protestas, si hubo resistencias, y tampoco si existieron negociaciones. Y esto no se da solo en estas fotos, sino también en el enfoque que tanto utilizamos, al menos en la sociología rural, que tiene que ver con la acumulación por desposesión. No creo que sea necesario ahondar en el concepto de David Harvey, acumulación por desposesión, por una cuestión de tiempo y porque seguramente la mayoría de ustedes está muy familiarizado con el tema. Basta entonces decir que es una reformulación del concepto acumulación primitiva que propuso Marx, y que según Harvey, a partir de la era neoliberal, el capital empieza a reproducirse fundamentalmente a través de esa comercialización de territorios y sectores sociales que habían estado parcial o totalmente fuera de la influencia del mercado. Las virtudes de este concepto para analizar las transformaciones rurales contemporáneas son múltiples. Es un concepto muy versátil que nos permite vincular procesos globales y locales, pero tiene ciertas limitaciones porque cae de alguna forma en un determinismo, a mi modo de ver. Es decir, en la formulación de Harvey se plantea que la preeminencia de estos procesos de acumulación por desposesión van a implicar necesariamente un creciente uso de la fuerza, y a su vez ese uso de la fuerza va a generar una mayor resistencia por parte de los sectores subalternos. Sin embargo, cuando recorremos las comunidades nos encontramos que no necesariamente los procesos de acumulación por desposesión generan resistencia, o no necesariamente todos resisten los mismos aspectos del proceso. Es por eso que en mi trabajo sostengo que para entender cómo se producen y reproducen estos procesos de transformación agraria, es necesario complementar el enfoque de la desposesión con enfoques que permitan ver de qué manera esos procesos son significados y experimentados de distinta forma por los grupos subalternos. Para a partir de allí intentar empezar a entender algunas de las razones por las cuales ciertos aspectos de estos procesos, en mi caso vinculados a la expansión de la soja, son problematizados y por qué otros no. Por eso retomo la idea de racionalidades locales de Nielsen y Cox, que son autores más ligados al estudio de los movimientos sociales. Y planteo que podemos pensar esa racionalidad local como formada por tres elementos: las memorias de los periodos previos. En mi caso va a ser muy importante el periodo algodonero, las experiencias concretas de desposesión, y con esto me refiero a que no es lo mismo cuando la desposesión se produce por una gran empresa de forma abrupta que cuando es de manera paulatina, por pequeños o medianos productores. Y el último elemento que tengo en cuenta es la posición de subalternidad. Y en esto, para hacerlo de forma sencilla, a lo que me refiero es que no es necesariamente la misma mirada de aquel que vive en el campo lindero al productor de soja del que no, ni tampoco de los indígenas, por ejemplo, que forman parte de instituciones o que son agentes sanitarios en la región. A continuación, analizo muy brevemente el ejemplo de Pampa del Indio. Me voy a centrar en un ejemplo de las memorias del periodo de algodón y en los modos en que los actores han significado las nuevas dinámicas. Pampa del Indio, en la década del 40, las comunidades empiezan a recibir títulos provisorios de lotes de 25 hectáreas y también herramientas y semillas para producir algodón. Por aquella época se conforma el paraje Campo Medina, que es fruto de la gestión del cacique Pedro Martínez con Perón, y luego en el 60, 70, las familias de allí obtienen nuevos lotes, esta vez de la mano de la Misión Evangélica Bautista. Estas familias que antes eran agregados en Campo Medina pasan a conformar el paraje conocido como Campo Nuevo. Estas familias producían algodón que vendían en la cooperativa indígena de Pampa del Indio es una de las primeras cooperativas indígenas que tuvo el país. A fines de la década del 80 comienza, digamos, lo que es la crisis, el final de este periodo algodonero. La población de Pampa del Indio entra en una fuerte crisis, en parte dado por la caída del precio del algodón, que hizo que muchos colones, principalmente los criollos, no pudieran continuar solventando las deudas que habían contraído, y muchos de ellos decidieron vender sus tierras. Esta situación agravó la crisis que tenían los COM, por un lado la crisis que ellos también sufrían en tanto productores, y la crisis del empleo. Digo, ya no estaban siendo empleados por las familias criollas. A mediados de la década del 90, un grupo empresario, Unitec Agro, compra grandes extensiones de tierras, algunas de las cuales eran fiscales, mientras que otras habían pertenecido a estos productores algodoneros de la zona, y funda allí el establecimiento Don Panos, el cual ocupa un área aproximada de 42.000 hectáreas sobre el río Bermejo, limitando con los parajes que mencioné al inicio. Inicialmente, en un contexto de fuerte recesión, los habitantes de Pampa del Indio recibieron esperanzados la noticia de la instalación de esta gran empresa. La expectativa de recibir un salario con el cual garantizar su sustento fue satisfecha temporalmente, ya que fueron varios los miembros de la comunidad contratados por Don Panos para hacer el desmonte y el destronque. Ahora, una vez finalizadas las obras, la reestructuración del territorio y las nuevas dinámicas rurales que esta traía aparejada comenzaron a hacerse palpables. La llegada de Don Panos implicó, en primer lugar, la pérdida de dos actividades a través de los cuales quienes habían permanecido en el campo complementaban su sustento que le otorgaba la producción, que era, por un lado, la marisca, y por otro, el trabajo estacional. El trabajo estacional deja de ser posible por la alta tecnificación de la empresa, y la marisca se ve limitada en gran medida por el cerco perimetral con seguridad que instala la empresa, así como también por la pérdida de la fauna y de la flora asociada al desmonte que se había producido. La producción de huertas o sementera baja de los COM también comienza a verse imposibilitada, principalmente por la escasez de agua que se vio profundizada por la desviación del río Bermejo que se realiza para alimentar el sistema de riego de la empresa, así como también por la contaminación generada por la deriva del viento y del uso de agroquímicos, ¿no? A partir del uso intenso de agroquímicos. Las denuncias contra la empresa comienzan recién en el 2006. Entre 2006 y 2012 existieron varias acciones de denuncia y reclamo. Se produjeron numerosas marchas, acampes y cortes de ruta. En el 2012 ya comienzan a bajar las denuncias, en parte porque un grupo de la comunidad logra uno de los objetivos de sus reclamos, que era obtener semillas para volver a producir algodón. Según denunciaban algunos miembros de la comunidad, esas semillas que les había otorgado el Ministerio de Seguridad Social de Nación eran transgénicas, y por lo tanto los miembros de la comunidad ya no podían criticarle a la empresa el uso de esa tecnología o de esas semillas. Como consecuencia, quienes siguieron denunciando fueron solamente los indígenas que vivían en los campos estrictamente linderos a la empresa. quienes logran un acuerdo con Don Panos, en el que se establece que no se va a fumigar un área de aproximadamente 600 metros, ¿no?, en el límite. Esto de todas formas fue violado por la empresa en sucesivas oportunidades, pero digamos el reclamo cayó porque había una parte ya importante de la comunidad que no participaba de la denuncia. Bueno, para entender por qué un grupo deja de protestar y otro sigue, o de resistir y otro sigue, como planteaba anteriormente, tenemos que comenzar investigando, creo yo, los recuerdos, las interpretaciones, o como diría Hart, los significados del despojo, porque en definitiva las resistencias surgen en parte como el resultado de los efectos que se perciben y experimentan en una relación. Entonces, lo que yo observé en Pampa del Indio es que en gran parte de las conversaciones en las que los COM recordaban las características del periodo algodonero, sostenían que el mismo se había caracterizado por una creciente participación de los indígenas en la producción, que a su vez la proliferación de esos productores algodoneros indígenas estaba muy ligada al seguimiento y a las ayudas. Y esta idea de seguimiento refería en general a la capacitación y a la supervisión realizada por los técnicos de programas estatales, como también de agencias religiosas o ONGs. Y también, por supuesto, a los recursos, en tanto semillas y herramientas que estos actores les brindaban. Es por ello que cuando hablábamos de los conflictos que ellos atravesaban en la actualidad y que estaban relacionadas con el avance de la soja en la región, eran muy pocos los que empezaban nombrando en realidad el conflicto con la empresa, con Don Panos. En la mayor parte de los casos, las narrativas estaban centradas primeramente en la ausencia del Estado y en la falta de ayuda para seguir manteniendo su trabajo en los campos. La falta de ayuda era casi siempre sinónimo de la ausencia del Estado, así como de los otros actores antes mencionados, ¿no?, las organizaciones religiosas, que habían sido muy importantes durante el periodo algodonero como proveedores de bienes y servicios. En la mayoría de los casos era su condición de indígenas la que explicaba la falta de esa ayuda. Es decir, generalmente argumentaban que el gobierno ya no quería reconocerlos en su rol de productores, que el gobierno ahora solo ayudaba a las grandes empresas. Ahora bien, la centralidad que tenían los relatos esa falta de ayuda en la percepción de la desposesión no significaba que los COM no mencionasen la llegada de Don Panos o la falta de agua, la contaminación, la imposibilidad de mariscar como amenazas a su permanencia en el campo, pero sí era notorio que eran particularmente quienes tenían contacto directo con la empresa o los agentes sanitarios quienes remarcaban la responsabilidad de la empresa y no del Estado. Entonces ahí vemos un poco esta idea que yo tengo de las diversas posiciones de subalternidad dentro de la comunidad. Para la gran mayoría de los entrevistados, las luchas, las demandas, los cortes de ruta, estaban entonces dirigidas al Estado, y lo que buscaban era, en primer lugar, alcanzar una igualdad de oportunidades con los campesinos criollos. No se trataba solamente de ser reconocidos como indígenas, sino que el Estado reconozca nuevamente su lugar en el sistema productivo. Al posicionarse como campesinos originarios, buscaban que el Estado vuelva a garantizarles ciertas relaciones y ciertas condiciones de producción. En muchos casos el objetivo era negociar más exitosamente la inclusión en el modelo antes que constituir un total rechazo a la agroindustria. Por supuesto que en otros casos, sobre todo, repito, quienes vivían cerca de la empresa, consideraban que la lucha debía ser por resguardar la producción agroecológica, destinada tanto al autoconsumo como a la venta. Y por eso en estos casos no estaban tan interesados en obtener herramientas y precios para sus producciones, sino que reclamaban el fin de las fumigaciones y la contaminación de las aguas, así como también las multas para la empresa. Sí, el foco era mucho más la empresa que el Estado en estos casos.
Te queda un minuto.
Ya terminé. A modo de cierre, solo me gustaría entonces remarcar que si bien las comunidades están tratando de revertir largas historias de desposesión, estas luchas no siempre o no necesariamente desafían las mismas relaciones, los mismos acercamientos o las mismas desposesiones. De ahí la necesidad, que yo creo tienen los estudios de la desposesión, de analizar con mayor profundidad los significados de la desposesión, es decir, cómo se experimentan y significan estos procesos, por qué luchan las organizaciones que lo hacen y por qué en otras comunidades parece no haber resistencia, como en el caso de la comunidad Mocoit, que por un tema de tiempo no llego a exponer aquí, pero que analizo en el capítulo. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, Mercedes. Muy interesante y hay muchos como paralelos entre esa y lo que voy a discutir ahora mismo. Entonces, a ver.
We can see your notes, Joel.
Thank you. How about now? Do you still see my notes?
Yep,
Okay. How about now?
still.
You still see my notes? Eesh.
Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
sorry. Let me try this again.
And we practiced this, you guys.
We practiced this. Yeah. Can you still see my notes now?
Yes.
Okay, give me 1 second. Sorry about that. Of course, the guy who's being strict on time is the one who is now having problems with let's try it one more time. Otherwise, I'll try a different option. Sorry about this. Ahora? Todavía.
Can't see anything.
You can't see anything?
No slides.
Okay, well, all right. Let's try something different. Sorry about that. What happened? Eesh. I don't know what's happening to my computer. Give me 1 quick second. There we go. All right. Okay, cool. Okay, sorry about that, everybody. Okay. And I am going to go like this. And you'll see my little slide deck on the side there, but that's just going to be kind of how it's going to go, because I know that we also practiced how to do it otherwise, but can you see it? You're shaking your head no, Nancy.
I can't see it. Can other people see it?
No, no se ve nada.
No, Joel, no veo.
No se ve, Joel.
No.
Mira vos. A ver.
Do you want to
No
let
sé.
Denise go first and then you can practice that?
I was just
Yeah.
going to say that. Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you.
Okay, Guido, we're on. All right, let me go ahead and share my screen. Can everybody see that okay?
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
Perfect.
Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. I just want to say thank you, Joel, and to the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Florida for organizing the event today. And many, many thanks to Sylvia, Mercedes, and Paola for their support in helping us refine this chapter. Our chapter explores the importance of natural gas production in the Bolivian Chaco and how it's shaped the possibilities for lowland indigenous groups, such as the Venayek, to recover ancestral lands, to consolidate greater levels of self-governance and autonomy, to access flows of gas rents in order to sustain traditional ways of living, as well as prospects for the Venayek TCO post-extraction. Since the mid-1990s, let's see, please. Okay.
Take your cursor up. There you go. You got it.
There we go. Okay, sorry. There we go. All right. Since the mid-1990s, Bolivia and much of Latin America have received enormous sums of foreign direct investment in oil, gas, and mineral extraction. Much of the expansion of natural resource extraction has occurred on lands historically claimed as territory by indigenous and campesino populations, and has frequently involved real and perceived processes of dispossession, as well as significant socio-environmental conflict. These processes of dispossession and conflict pit communities, companies, and states against each other in broad struggles over the governance of territory. But the extractive economy also creates new and significant disparities and conflicts within local populations, strengthening some local political economic projects while weakening others. Such internally differentiated dimensions of conflict and inequality have received much less attention than have the broader processes of dispossession. Yet their implications for populations affected by extraction can be critical because they elicit new patterns of social differentiation and identity formation, and they affect the nature of possibilities for any future collective action. So here in slide 2, I just have a brief overview, if you will, of some key periods in the most current hydrocarbon cycle. And this hydrocarbon cycle has been referred to as a super cycle in terms of a prolonged period of both strong international demand for oil and gas, as well as sustained high prices internationally. I want to point out that in 2006, Bolivia was able to renegotiate contracts with multinational companies that were highly favorable to the country. And this led to a huge influx of resources to subnational governments and to the central government. And in particular, to producing regions such as the Department of Tarija, which has up to recently been the driver of the hydrocarbon boom in the country. Bolivia's state-led model of natural resource extraction has a number of important goals, including promoting industrialization, value-added activities to generate and retain additional profits, but also expanding natural resource extraction into new non-traditional areas in order that each department could generate their own royalties. The most important element of the state-led model has been with what we call extraction with redistribution. That is using revenues that are generated from natural resource extraction, in this case gas, to fund social policy commitments. The cash transfer programs largely funded by natural resource extraction are seen as a key element in Bolivia's poverty reduction and ability to get resources to rural areas in ways that had not been done before. So I just want to point out over on the right is a map of the recent areas that are considered under exploration. And you'll see that 100 of these areas are actually held in reserve by the hydrocarbon company of Bolivia, Yacimientos. And you'll see at the bottom towards Tarija, that is the more traditional area where most of the current extraction is taking place. Another important point here is that there is no area in Bolivia that is off limits to hydrocarbon exploration activity. Oil and gas are considered strategic assets to the national economy, and the Supreme Decree of 2366 of 2015 actually has permitted exploratory activities to go forward in the country's protected areas. Here, I want to talk about how in this state-led model of extraction, we see an important break with a model of relationships that existed up to then. So in post-2005, we see an important break with the neoliberal model of extraction. This leads to a reordering of relationships and negotiations between the state and social organizations affected by extraction. For example, CIDOB petitions for greater social protections, including free, prior, and informed consent, later come to be known as consulta y participación, as well as social monitoring, among other demands. So while before we had a concession model in which transnational companies deal directly with community leaders, post-2006, we see the implementation of a contract model in which transnational firms are now partnering with the state to extract, and the state assumes the relationship between communities or TCOs and other social organizations. I just want to point out here, this is a map of the TCO Venayek, and you can see the red lines are the overlays of the hydrocarbon contract. And an important thing to keep in mind is that the entire TCO is within what's considered an area of potential interest for hydrocarbon activities. Important to keep in mind is that hydrocarbons and in particular exploratory activities around gas were taking place long before the TCO constituted itself and created and sent a demand to the national government for recognition. So activities predate, hydrocarbon activities predate the establishment. And in one case, an elder in one of the communities told me that Tesoro, the company that first conducted exploratory activities, entered and began laying seismic testing lines, digging trenches and laying lines to conduct testing, which involves using low-level explosives to pick up imagery. These seismic lines, by the way, still can be seen in satellite images. So British Gas Bolivia picks up the concession in the late 90s during the gas boom. And in the last few years, Shell Bolivia took over British Gas and took over operations of the 5 gas fields in the TCO Venayek. And I will turn to Guido now to talk a little bit about Orcahueta, the organization that represents the Venayek.
Thanks, Denise. Good afternoon to everyone. I will continue in Spanish, easier for me. Lo que queremos remarcar en el estudio es que el pueblo guanayé, que tendría más o menos unas 5.000 personas en el territorio, luego de haber recibido durante 20 años un monto aproximado de $3,5 millones en efectivo, vemos que los impactos, por ejemplo, se muestran en una lucha constante entre dirigentes indígenas por acceder al dinero y a los recursos que genera el tema político. En este momento se tienen, por ejemplo, 3 dirigencias máximas, varios de los cuales se alían con una autoridad local, otros a nivel departamental y otros a nivel nacional. Vemos que una economía muy precaria de pescadores temporales que trabajan durante 5 meses en la pesca y luego tienen 7 meses de problemas de desnutrición crónica. Bueno, el problema no ha cambiado, se mantiene la misma problemática, solamente a diferencia que tenemos ahora sí una estructura de poder en la cual unas 60 familias tienen acceso a dinero, digamos, rápido, en efectivo, y 1.100 familias quedan a su suerte, ¿no? Buscando alimentos, ya sea en el bosque, en la pesca, en la agricultura incipiente, y de esto, bueno, finalmente nos muestra cómo a veces las empresas petroleras ingresan buscando tal vez generar un aporte positivo, pero lo hacen sin control y regulación, y terminamos afectando cierta moneda a nivel comunal y generando yo diría como segmentos de poder diferenciado, ¿no? Una pequeña dirigencia social que maneja el poder político y económico y el resto que queda sin información, sin poder acceder a los recursos y sin beneficio finalmente. Denise, te paso la palabra si quieres continuar.
Gracias, Guido. So very quickly, this is one of the earliest consultation and participation processes carried out in Bolivia. This one took place beginning in 2008. And while the government introduced new institutions to reshape state indigenous TCO relations around extraction. In effect, the consultation process led to a situation in which it closed out space for larger conversations about alternatives to extraction or what happens after extraction. And so the gas and the gas projects occupy the center, if you will, of the conversations. And the other thing that happens here is that the government actually shortcuts its own processes in order to get to the discussion of compensation, and uses political solutions to resolve conflicts in order to get the projects back on track. I just want to make a few final comments here. From 2013 onwards, interest in recovering territory has been gradually replaced with struggles to access monetary resources from hydrocarbon companies. As a result, there have been more internal struggles over TCO land. Since 2017, there have been numerous complaints filed by capitanes in the TCO warning of the illegal sale of land by Orcahueta leaders. As we know, the sale of TCO lands is illegal. And as Guido mentioned, the flow of financial resources up to now has been significant. However, the agreements in place, both first with BG, now Shell, and also with Transierra, are coming to an end. So we see how the Venayek see the state and have tried to manage its relationship with the state from a weak position. And in the new context, where we have a return of a mass government, there will be increased pressure to replace hydrocarbon reserves, though it's unclear how that will play out on hydrocarbon in the TCO Venayek. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Denise and Guido. Wonderful presentation. And we'll see if mine works. You guys were both quite short on time, so that's great. That helps us with some of the time that I took up. Let's try it again. Do you see the notes or okay, excellent. Okay, cool. Thanks so much. All right, thanks so much, everybody. And thanks again to Sylvia, Paola, and Mercedes for organizing and editing this wonderful, edited volume, and for giving me the opportunity to contribute to the book. It's really so nice to be here with you all, and I appreciate the time that you have all taken to not only draw together this collection, but also all of the authors and contributors as well for sharing the important work that you're doing. I've learned a lot from your works and appreciate the opportunity to be part of that conversation. So today, my talk is going to draw from the chapter that I contributed to the edited volume, and it's based on work that I've been conducting primarily between 2013 and 2017. So this is a little bit of a retrospective in a sense that focused on the implementation of Inter-American Court of Human Rights cases in Paraguay's Bajo Chaco. So today I'm going to tease out one little sliver from that project and also focus on one element of the chapter for the edited volume, the infrastructures of settler colonialism. See if that'll go. So the chapter I contributed to this volume traces the roots of ranching to the early missionary efforts to establish settler colonies, practices that required dispossessing Inchlet peoples of their lands and enrolling them as laborers to work on ranches. In that chapter, I argue that settler colonialism, understood as a structure of social spatial relations, is mediated through material objects like roads and embodied infrastructure like labor that reveal how infrastructural violence operates on an everyday basis. The work contributes to an emergent, if not as well theorized aspect of the infrastructural turn, and that is the material and symbolic relations of infrastructure and settler colonialism. So today my talk is going to be a bit more theoretical than empirical, and in the time remaining, I'm going to share some excerpts from my chapter and focus particularly on the role that roads and fences play in contemporary forms of infrastructural violence that many of my Inchlet interlocutors regularly confront. So the political economy of cattle ranching in the Bajo Chaco and its interplay with Inchlet life resonates with the friction between indigenous peoples and agro-extractivism across settler colonial frontiers of the Gran Chaco and in many parts of Latin America. Such forms of friction are often mediated through infrastructural components upon which broader systems operate, whether those components be the bodies of laborers working on and for these ranches, to the very roads and fences and stock ponds that facilitate the organization of cattle life. That said, in the chapter, I'm developing an argument that the structures of settler colonialism operate through diverse material and embodied forms. Due to time today, I'm going to focus less on the role of indigenous labor, but reflect on the material structures of settler colonialism. And so Patrick Wolf's seminal theorization of settler colonialism as a structure of social spatial relations, not an event, has been extremely productive to theorizations of colonial power in the Americas. However, what is less often examined is the role that material objects themselves play within settler colonialism and the imbrication in forms of physical and epistemic violence. The material objects in question today, again, are fences and roads. And so for context, nearly 95% of the land in the Bajo Chaco is private property, and of that, virtually all is used for cattle ranching today. The Paraguayan state sold its Chaco land holdings in the late 1800s to finance debts incurred during the War of the Triple Alliance, and the subsequent establishment and imposition of private property in the Bajo Chaco set forth a process of land dispossession, materially reinforced today by fences that limit and delimit Antlet people's access to their traditional territories. But the fences that limit access to private lands also work in tension with roads that facilitate mobilities for those who are able to use them. And the people of Yaquiaxa and Sohoyamaxa lived and labored for generations on ranches established on their traditional territories, enclosed entirely on these territories, right? Both communities came to occupy the margin of Ruta 5, which you see in this picture here. So that's Ruta 5 highway that runs through the middle, and you see the community of Yaquiaxa, which are these small houses here built in the margin, all the way up against the fence that delimits the extent of a private property right. So both communities came to occupy the margin of Ruta 5 after they initiated legal claims for land rights, calling for the restitution of their lands via norms established in the Paraguayan law during the during the 1980s and early 1990s. Ranch owners responded by denying community members permission to continue living and laboring on the ranches, and while the Paraguayan state did little to enforce laws outlining legal protections for indigenous peoples at the same time, as we heard in Paulo's conversation as well to some degree in another kind of context. And as a result, two Antlet communities established Yaquiaxa and Sohoyamaxa in the only publicly available lands in the area, this 30-meter wide strip of land between Ruta 5 and the ranch fences built upon the lands that both communities claimed. In the margin of the highway, the lack of access to reliable and clean sources of drinking water and other state services, as well as the deadly threat of vehicular traffic, are but some of the factors that inflict forms of violence that I suggest are infrastructural. Such violence is built into the everyday geographies of the margin and has caused many of the human rights violations that propelled each community's case to the Inter-American system in the early 2000s. But what then is the relationship between infrastructure and settler colonialism? Infrastructure studies in anthropology and geography grapple with spectacular development projects as well as mundane objects that condition everyday life. If, as Hetherington and Campbell suggest, infrastructure is always about the future or distant futures, one must always question whose vision of that future is advancing with what effects on social difference, I suggest. And further, Gaston Gordillo's ethnography of rubble in Argentina and efforts to, quote, politicize object-oriented approaches through an attentiveness to destruction, violence, and reification, end quote, provide a helpful analytical framework to analyze the imbrication of infrastructure and injustice. I engage everyday objects of ranching and histories of Antlet labor to center on this question of infrastructural violence then, building from Rogers and O'Neill that have argued that infrastructural violence seeks to squarely identify the political economy underlying social spatial production of suffering. And so while Rogers and O'Neill focus on urban design and justice in the city, I shift the analysis to South America's rural heartland to show how ranching infrastructures disproportionately shape, discipline, and facilitate violence against indigenous peoples. And I think this is something that resonates across the region. Thus, I use the term infrastructural violence to shift the analysis of structural violence to material forms through which it operates within geographies of power. I engage the intersection of violence and infrastructure because doing so allows my analysis to focus on how violence with no precise locus still has an undeniable impact on suffering and mortality by material objects and their effects. While the Inter-American Court found the Paraguayan state culpable of human rights violations against members of Yaquiaxa and Sohoyamaxa, much of the violence experienced in both communities is diffuse and without a clear perpetrator, though often mediated by these infrastructural forms. So therefore, things like fences and roads that reinforce dispossession also become analytical sites to understand manifestations of material and epistemic violence that result from settler colonialism. And I now turn to kind of ground my comments in place. So Ruta 5 connects, let's see if this will work in this one. Yeah, Ruta 5 connects the towns of Pozo Colorado and Concepcion, Paraguay, while simultaneously bisecting Jaque Axa, while simultaneously bisecting Jaque Axa and Sohoyamaxa. The road passes few other small communities nestled in the highway's margin, and most are comprised of a handful of houses made of faded gray palm wood with tin roofs. Palm trees and cattle pastures dominate the landscape as one travels down the highway, save for the chance that a freshly skinned animal, honey in a repurposed plastic soda bottles, or fans woven from palm leaves might be hanging from a stake. Oh my goodness, it just crashed on me. Okay, what a series of snafus. I'm just going to go straight to the paper and we're going to leave the presentation. Sorry, everybody. That's phenomenal. Give me 1 second to catch my place. Excellent. All right, so honey in repurposed plastic soda bottles or fans woven from palm leaves might be hanging from a stake near the highway's edge, advertising their sale to the passerby. The goods serve as markers that call to the eye because they break with the landscape otherwise defined by seemingly continuous cattle ranches and remnants of traditional or transitional palm and scrub forest. Makeshift memorials commemorating lives lost to traffic accidents or due to an inability to access transportation to the nearest medical post are other markers that break with the pattern of fence rows and signs that announce propiedad privada. However, it seems likely that many people pass by without taking notice of the homes, people, and lives on the margin of the highway. But from the side of the road, it is difficult not to notice each passing car or bus or the trucks carrying cattle to the slaughter. The vehicles are loud and interrupt sounds of kids playing, people talking during community meetings, and the shrill song of countless locusts in the afternoon sun of summer. The traffic passes day and night while most people in Jaque Axa and Sohoyamaxa have little to no access to transportation other than their feet, often referred to as Línea 11. Línea 11 literally means line 11, or is a metaphor for bus route 11 that also evokes the shape of two parallel legs, silhouettes that mimic the number 11. Instead of taking a bus, Línea 11 means the person will be walking. Life on the side of the road is pedestrian. In contrast to the traffic, the pace of life is slow. Kids play on cracked earth or dry mud, depending upon the season. Excuse me, cracked dry earth or mud, depending upon the season. Families go to the small Pentecostal church, while some still practice what many refer to as cultura indígena. Women wash clothes in pond dug into the margin, and men often look for scarce day labor opportunities on nearby ranches. In many ways, everyday life on the margin of the highway is not unusual in comparison with many other rural communities across the region that are subject to the challenges and opportunities posed by large-scale cattle ranching. Wage labor is sparse, as is access to state services, and struggles for land rights abound. But the margins, such as the places where Jaque Axa and Sohoyamaxa are situated geographically and physically, margins have long held a contradictory and tenuous relation in anthropological and geographic inquiry, seen as sites of exploitation and oppression by some, while as generative sites of resistance, innovation, and hope for others. Rather than an either-or proposition, I understand the margin as a liminal space better captured by a both-and relation. Something that bell hooks captures by stating, quote, "To be in the margin is to be part of the whole but outside of the body," end quote. Cattle ranch infrastructures create the geographic margins that Anchilet peoples have long occupied, exemplifying how settler colonial structures both enroll indigenous peoples as subjects of rights and dispossess them of those rights simultaneously. Roads and fences are material infrastructures that underscore the social, political, and geographic marginalization of Jaque Axa and Sohoyamaxa in relation to the Paraguayan state and area cattle ranchers. Roads indeed provide a critical link to necessary services, but the presence or absence of transportation can also prove deadly and tormenting. Fences that once provided labor to Anchilet employed to build them now restrict their access to ancestral territories and define a settler colonial grid of property in land that reiterates dispossession. And so roads, therefore, alongside the way that they work with fences, make easy foils from which to consider infrastructure in relation to dispossession and violence in these cases. Ruta 5, the road that bisects Jaque Axa and Sohoyamaxa, is one of two paved roads that transect the Paraguayan Chaco. The ruta is thus a crucial transportation artery that facilitates the circulation of Mennonite and other ranchers' goods, mainly cattle and dairy products. Rather than mere conduits of transportation, the highways are intimately bound with an ongoing project to modernize and settle Paraguay's frontier spaces by establishing extractive economic activities. The Paraguayan Chaco's transformation to a site of extensive cattle production helps construct an image of the region as a space produced by industrious white settlers who tamed the country's western frontier and turned it into a central node in the global and political economies of cattle production. In the chapter, I kind of push back on that by emphasizing and highlighting the role of indigenous labor in those systems. But due to Mennonite settlers' predominant role in their successful dairy cooperatives and ranching operations in the central Chaco, they are colloquially credited with bringing order to the region and igniting its economic potential. Mennonite settlers were instrumental in lobbying the Paraguayan state to construct and pave the Trans and Ruta 5 highways to facilitate their access to markets so that they could sell goods produced by their cooperatives, while Mennonites also influenced and ensured the paving of Ruta 5. That road that bisects Jaque-Axa and Sohoyamaxa actually follows the course of old Anglican missionary supply lines that were actually created and dug into the landscape by Enchlet laborers. Therefore, the road itself connects sites of cattle production and exchange, but also connects experiences of indigenous exploitation and dispossession across time. Ruta 5 enables mobility, but its function to facilitate the transport of cattle is realized in quiet tandem with a patchwork of barbed wire fences that run parallel to the road and refract outward to trace the property lines of seemingly innumerable cattle ranches. In the Bajo Chaco, the fences dissect a vast floodplain and semi-arid palm forest into pasture lands where cattle are confined to graze on ranches owned by Paraguayan, Uruguayan, Brazilian, Mennonite, US, English, and Korean cattle ranchers. The fences that demarcate property lines and pastures are core infrastructural components that materially score the settler colonial structures into the landscape, and ranches operate in a dialectic of mobility and containment enabled by the relations between roads and fences. The former facilitate the transportation of cattle products, laborers, and capital, while the latter ensure that cattle stay where they should and enforce the exclusionary logics of private property and land. And coming close to wrapping up, located on the margin of Ruta 5, people from Jaque-Axa and Sohoyamaxa have had a tenuous relationship with mobility and containment. The road promises mobility, but the lack of transportation ensures that most people spend their days between the highway and the fences that delimit ranch boundaries. The situation limits Enchlet access to necessary resources, particularly hunting grounds and reliable water. By focusing on infrastructural components used in ranching in this chapter, I attempt to show that material infrastructures and labor as embodied infrastructure are central to the operation of settler colonial systems and the production of racial geographies. Ranches and cattle advance state territoriality in the Chaco, Paraguayan Chaco, while simultaneously coding the space as productive and white, as non-indigenous and oriented toward capital accumulation. Paraguay's Chaco roads and fences are two material infrastructural components that provide daily reminders that the region is Paraguayan state territory, despite many critiques that the state is by and large absent in this vast frontier. Instead of state officials or an official state presence, one more often sees countless cattle grazing on pastures among palm forests that lie behind or within the confines of barbed wire fences that correspond with private property rights of ranchers and other settlers, as well as investors who have endeavored to transform the Chaco into a platform for cattle production. The ranching industry's ongoing expansion continues to draw spaces once on the Paraguayan state's margins into the logics of capital accumulation and settler colonialism, while extracting everyday forms of infrastructural violence on the lives of those dispossessed by that system. So thanks so much for your attention. Sorry for all of these snafus with the presentation. It's truly phenomenal. So look forward to opening this up to broader conversations. I think there's a lot of resonance between different papers that we heard, and there's also distinct points. I'm curious to see what we have going on with the questions here. And then let's see, we have Denise is back, Guido, Mercedes, and Nancy. So does anyone from the audience, the public, would you like to turn on a camera and join the conversation? Do you have a burning question that you'd like to throw into the mix before I look over here to the chat? Or perhaps a panelist as well might have something to comment and add initially. Yeah, please, Nancy, we should just jump right in. Mm-hmm.
Thanks. Thanks for all the papers, and it was really great to hear them all together. I wanted to ask Denise and Guido if they could talk a little bit more about the stratification that's resulting from the money coming in from gas rents. If you could talk about how it's decided who gets funds. You know, you said a whole group of people have some and others don't. If you could talk a little bit more about that, that's fascinating. I asked that particularly because in Nicaragua, that's exactly what people are worried about. That's really one of the things they're concerned about when they, you know, they're already getting some rents, but it's gone through the capitanías. And of course, some people claim that these leaders have held on to the money and that they haven't distributed it well. You know, other ways that people are always concerned about the ways that rents are distributed. And I just wanted to ask you if you could say more about that.
You can
Guido,
speak. Okay, I will begin. First of all, I think that the initial communities were very horizontal in power. They reject the leaderships, but now we see more and more often that the indigenous leaders are becoming more powerful, and they become a small group of leaders, and they don't allow the other peoples to know what's happening. They don't know about the contracts, how much money is coming, and just it has become a closed group, so that they go to Santa Cruz, they get the money in bags, and they just distribute between I said about 60 families, and the other people does not know how to get involved, benefited. So since 20 years ago, we are watching now that there are a little leadership that is very close, and they don't give information, they don't inform the people, and more and more we are seeing that the problems, the basic problems, are still the same. I said about especially problems with hunger. They have not access to water, and also very bad education. So that as long as the leaders have more power, they forget their traditions about sharing the power, the rotating in the post. So sometimes we see that the equilibrium, that I don't say that word, it's broken, and more, especially men, are more powerful than before, and women get lesser information, and also excluded from the decision post. And so that's a point. Denise, if you want to add some mentions.
Right. I guess I would say, Nancy, one of the things that I found is it has a lot to do with the company that the communities are engaging with and the practices of those companies. There's a lot of incentive to not being transparent and accountable, right? And that has been the default for British Gas Bolivia. I can't speak about Shell. Shell is much more advanced in thinking about how it engages with indigenous communities, but I don't know how they're engaging in this instance. What I will say, though, is there's a widespread company practice of using non-disclosure agreements linked to the contracts and agreements signed with indigenous groups. Those are fatal. They really are nefasta in so many ways. And if that is in practice, you're fighting an uphill battle in terms of transparency and accountability. Because, and in the case of the Benayek, I think we're really talking about an extreme case. Well, I'm not even sure anyone knows where those agreements are. So there's no monitoring, there's no oversight committee. And I just want to highlight one more point that Guido made that I think is really important. this whole process is highly gendered. Women leaders who 10, 15 years ago said they actually had more voice and more presence in decision making feel completely marginalized and even mistreated, and verbally mistreated and told to leave and the rest of it. So those are two things I would say, you know, thinking forward for other communities, those would be things to be attentive to. I mean, there's a long list, but those strike me as most important.
So important, the idea of the role of Indigenous leaders. And I think about Federico, your first paper talked about that too in the 1940s, right? You know, I've written about that in the early period in Santa Cruz as well. And that goes all the way back to Javier Albo's early writings about Guarani leaders and what makes a good murubicha and all that stuff. So yeah, it's very interesting to see how leaders can take advantage of situations like this, and in other cases be extremely responsive and transparent. So yeah, thank you very much. Super interesting work.
Penelope, did you want to add a question in there or a comment?
Or just tell us from your perspective, because I picked up your work, of course, Penelope.
I didn't want to kind of monopolize the question and answer, but I mean, I have so many questions. They were such rich presentations from all of you. I guess with your presentation, Nancy, I found really fascinating because I've been looking a bit at the process of constructing regional autonomy in Gran Chaco province, and that way in which the kind of elite autonomy projects are coalescing around these strategic kind of alliances with Indigenous peoples. Obviously, the difference there is that the route to Indigenous, either municipal or territorial autonomy, is very firmly closed in Tarija, for reasons you'll be aware of. But yeah, I think it's really fascinating to see how there are these kind of new alliances forming around different visions of autonomy between different scales. So I'd just love to talk more with you about that. It's really interesting.
And that's so complicated because people really have very different interests, but they have to come together in some way. In a certain sense, it's kind of like the epitome of politics to see how people are negotiating those things.
Exactly, and that's why I think, you know, the kind of Guarani diplomacy idea is useful, because it allows us to get beyond these kind of familiar tropes of, you know, resistance versus co-option, to understand, you know, how do Indigenous peoples navigate these kind of multi-scalar power relations. And I mean, I think I see one thing that's happened in Bolivia, although the kind of plurinationalism and extractivism are often seen as, you know, competing elements of the process of change, they actually have kind of coalesced together around these processes of constructing autonomy that's linked also to development aspirations, kind of ways of aspirations to control actually the spending of gas rents, which is partly what these things become about. So that's just really interesting. I also really enjoyed, well, I enjoyed all the talks, but Mercedes, I really appreciated your presentation. It resonated in a way for me with the work of Tanya Lee, who's kind of asked that same question about, you know, how can we understand actually the absence of resistance to dispossession in particular contexts. And one thing I would be curious to know actually more about is the question of indigeneity in this context, and the fact that people have gone through this experience of being cotton producers and you know, perhaps have identities connected to production, being small producers. Does indigeneity kind of figure in these demands, or has that form of identity and politics been somewhat, you know, pushed aside by these other processes?
No, yo creo que van de la mano, no es una u otra, sino que cambia, digamos, hay grupos que si queremos resaltan más, podríamos llamarlo así, un aspecto que nosotros podríamos entender, o digo, el imaginario, ¿no? Como lo indígena, ¿no? Lo más tradicional que puede tener con las culturas, y otros, como el caso que yo explicaba, que es un grupo que forma parte de una organización, que es la Unión Campesina, ¿no? Tiene otra mirada, en el cual no se deja de lado nunca lo indígena no está, ellos se reivindican a Taigoshik, que es, digamos, fue un cacique muy importante en Pampa del Indio, que consiguió, digamos, en el 22 las tierras, las primeras tierras, digamos, ellos se reivindican como indígenas, pero resaltan que son campesinos originarios, ¿no? Y en ese sentido, lo que yo planteo es que ya al posicionarse de esa forma, los reclamos incluyen también cuestiones productivas muy fuertes, que en algunos casos pueden chocar, digamos, con las demandas de otros grupos en los cuales este rol tan productivo no está presente.
Gracias, muy fascinante.
I'd like to ask a quick question of you, Nancy, thinking about the road and perhaps, thinking about the road in particular. I was struck in 2019, I had the opportunity to go from Charagua, the Charagua Ciudad, and out that new road that's being constructed. And I was struck by the presence of so much Chinese investment in that road, or this role of Chinese workers. And I understand that those funds get mediated and run through the central state, but how do you see, and perhaps Denise and Penelope, you can speak to this as well, and Guido, thinking about like the increasing role and presence of Chinese investment in Bolivia with regard to development projects and the formation of new autonomies? Are there direct relations between autonomous governments and the Chinese government, or is it always mediated through the Bolivian state first and foremost? How does that kind of relationship happen? And thinking about the ways in which, for example, in your work, Penelope, as well, the ways in which hydrocarbon rents are renegotiated through these new autonomous kind of relationships. What is the role of Chinese investment in this, and how does that kind of change some of the dynamics, or does it? This is open for any of you to respond.
I can start by saying that I haven't been there for 2 years now, but when I was there, it was the same. There was just massive Chinese investment, and what the Guaranis, both the elected officials and the traditional leaders and everybody that talked about it said is that they felt completely cut off from any decision making about who got the contracts for the road. They had no ability to negotiate with them. Their negotiation was directly with the state. And here were these Chinese companies with Chinese staff who didn't really speak Spanish, who didn't come into town. They stay out in their own campamentos, and completely oblivious to any of the needs of the local communities to mitigate any damage. They're just like this giant machine that's going forward that the Guaranis had absolutely no contact with. At least that's how it was 2 years ago. Now that was just at the beginning of the new Guido government, the new IO government. I don't know whether that's changed now, but they were all complaining about that. And it was also true that at the same time they were doing a bunch of, I think it was an Argentine oil company was doing explosions of the kind Denise was talking about, all in the mountains all around the city of Charagua. And the same was true of them. They had their own camp, their own everything. And, they would come in wearing these blue jumpsuits, and it was like aliens from another planet wearing their own clothes and speaking their own language and just like going back out. So the Guaranis felt really, alienated and dispossessed by it, and that their concerns about environmental damage and any kind of mitigation were it was impermeable to their concerns. I don't know whether other people have the same feeling, Denise or Guido, if you have a different take on it.
I've only been looking at Chinese investment in infrastructure in Latin America at a larger level. So all I can say is, you know, the usual levers that we would use to force companies to engage in FPIC processes or to allow for social monitoring and social and environmental monitoring of a project, those levers don't function so well. With these are state-to-state agreements, and they come packaged. And I think what you can say best is that the Chinese do not condition their direct assistance for infrastructure projects. So it's a whole different arrangement, and therefore, and Bolivia's been one that has very much welcomed Chinese investment. So I think in terms of the infrastructure, it's a completely different way of doing projects. Although I'm not familiar with any particular project on the ground in Bolivia, I do know that on many occasions there have been complaints, particularly about some of the bridge construction. But I'll leave it at that because I don't know the particulars of the specific projects in Bolivia.
Joel and Denise, yo quisiera agregar que sabemos que por lo menos desde la Embajada China hay una fuerte política y muy agresiva de conseguir contratos con los municipios, por ejemplo, para vender productos que tienen las fábricas chinas, por ejemplo, aparatos para hacer, bueno, para las morgues, para incinerar a los fallecidos, proyectos para hacer reciclaje. Entonces es una política muy fuerte comercial. No hay una política de cooperación en ningún sentido, solamente puede ser vinculado al tema de crédito o al tema de construcción de puentes o obras civiles o productos finales.
Penelope, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I'm really not an expert at all on the dynamics of Chinese investment, but it seems a really important question looking to the future. And I'm actually currently reading Martín Arboleda's book, The Planetary Mine, and he basically argues that increasingly this kind of new form of you know, what he calls planetary urbanism with these kind of logistics infrastructures relies on the state to basically you know, implement the violence that's necessary for the protection of those huge infrastructures. So I mean, I don't know. I guess we're moving from, you know, the neoliberal era when we had a very kind of weak state regulation, but transnational companies becoming kind of increasingly sophisticated in their corporate social responsibility policies. And I mean, it raises the question of whether these social demands are going to be more directed at the state rather than companies. But I mean, I don't have much experience from my own work on that, but I think it's an important question.
I know Brett has been working a lot on the question of China. Brett, if you want to weigh in on this.
The host has stopped my video, but can you hear me?
Yeah,
yes,
we can hear you.
Oh, I'm actually, I don't know a lot about China, but what is being said resonates with what I wrote about in the book, what Denise says about the gendered stratification of rent distribution and the question of the flattening of consultation processes in order to expedite the distribution of compensation of some sort. It sounds all very familiar, but I appreciate hearing the comparative cases from Denise and the recounting of Charagua's story, which is quite remarkable. Remains to be seen if it simply democratizes corruption or it turns into something else.
That's the question, right? Yeah. Thank you, Brett.
Thank you.
And thanks to all of the panelists and audience here. I want to be mindful of time because we have a very real phenomenon of Zoom cansancio for many people. And we have a third mesa that's coming up shortly. We have a 25-minute break. And so we will be restarting again at 3 o'clock Eastern time. Thank you so much, Nancy, Denise, Guido, Mercedes, for your papers. Thanks everyone for your patience with the technical glitches, and Penelope and Brett for the wonderful comments and questions there. So look forward to seeing you